Hey, good morning, church. This is Pastor Ryan. A couple years ago, when I led a church group to Israel, our tour bus got stuck in the traffic of Jerusalem. All of a sudden, our bus driver, a Muslim guy named Musa, hopped out of the bus and he started offering some assistance to a conservative, observant, Hasidic Jewish family that was struggling with their car. And then Ike, who was a secular Jewish guy, hopped out of the bus too to come and give a hand to the people who were in need. We tend to think of the Middle East as a place where tribal divisions have separated people and kept them from peace for thousands and thousands of years. And yet, in the middle of traffic, I got to see, with a bunch of Christians on board the bus, this devout Muslim, this secular Jew, working together to help some very observant Jews get back on the road again. Now, we Americans, we tend to think of this as a prototypical Good Samaritan story, right? We think of Good Samaritans, we think of roadside assistance. In fact, you can still see RVs that are on the road that have that great sticker of Good Sam, a cartoon character with a golden halo behind his head. Well, Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan is so well loved that many Americans have forgotten that Samaritans were actually the bad guys in those days. No one in Jesus' original audience thought that the Samaritans would ever have a halo around their heads. Now, a few years before Jesus' preaching ministry, the Samaritans had scattered human bones in the Jerusalem temple in order to contaminate the heart of Jewish piety. It was a mean trick. And rabbis routinely cursed out the Samaritans in the synagogue. Rabbi Eleazar claimed that Samaritans were so filthy that he who eats the bread of a Samaritan is like one who has eaten the flesh of a swine. Of course, we like to eat bacon, but the biblical Jews did not. The parable of the Good Samaritan works best if you grew up believing that the Samaritans are not the good guys with a halo on their head, but you grew up believing that there is no way that a Samaritan could ever be good. Now, first of all, the Jews and the Samaritans, they were divided by religion. Both the Jews and the Samaritans believed in the same God, but they couldn't agree on the theology. The Jews worshiped in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, and the Samaritans worshiped on top of Mount Gerizim. Both the Jews and the Gentiles accepted the law that we find in the Old Testament, but the Samaritans rejected all the Jewish prophets. It's probably best to consider the Jews and the Samaritans as different denominations rather than different religions. But Jesus, in today's story of the Good Samaritan, is definitely confronting religious prejudice. Second, the Jews and the Samaritans were divided over politics. Now, in chapter 9 of the Gospel of Luke, right before today's story, Jesus visited a Samaritan village before he told today's story about the Good Samaritan. And Jesus sent some messengers ahead in order to have people prepare a room for him and to take care of him. But the Samaritans refused him because they resented Jesus that he was going to go to Jerusalem, which was the heart of Jewish culture and religion and politics. They wanted nothing to do with it. They wanted no part of helping Jesus get to Jerusalem. And so the disciples were so offended by the lack of hospitality that they found among the Samaritans of all people that they asked Jesus for permission to call down fire from heaven and to destroy the Samaritan village. Oh boy, Jesus rebuked his disciples for totally overreacting. Jesus is confronting not just religious prejudice in today's story, he's confronting political prejudice because the Jews and the Samaritans were divided by a lot of political issues. Now, most importantly, the Jews and the Samaritans were divided by race. At least the Jews felt that they were. The Jews claimed to be direct descendants of Abraham and Sarah, And the Samaritans, they also claimed that, but they claimed to be descended from the lost tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. Those are two of the tribes of Israel that were taken away by the enemies of God's people. Now, the Jews, they took great pride in their ethnic identity. They didn't marry strangers, foreigners, not even when they were kicked out of their homeland. But the Samaritans, well, they did intermarry with a series of foreign invaders. And so the Jews were so offended by this that they thought that the Samaritan family tree was crazy, branches that didn't belong on a family tree. And so they denied that there was any relation between them and the Samaritans, even though they had the same ancestors. Jesus is confronting racism in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, we have seen a whole lot of anger about religion and politics and racism in the news lately. Mark Twain famously quipped, "Never discuss politics or religion in polite company." Well, of course, what makes Mark Twain's novels so great in American culture is exactly that he found a way to address religion and politics and racism with both wisdom and humor. In a similar way, Jesus crafted the parable of the Good Samaritan in order to critique the religious and political and racial divisions of his day with some wisdom and some humor, just like Mark Twain. Jesus was never afraid to talk about politics or religion or race, no matter who was in his company. And his followers shouldn't be either. Now, today's parable is an answer to a hostile cross-examination from a lawyer. And Jesus is illustrating the greatest commandment that we find in the Old Testament, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. The lawyer knew this. That's actually a quote from the lawyer, not Jesus. But he was absolutely right. Jesus recognized that the lawyer nailed it. The problem was that many people who claimed to love God didn't really love their neighbor. And what the lawyer was trying to do in his cross-examination was to excuse himself and to exclude some people from love in his life. He wanted to have a tight boundary of who was considered a neighbor, so he'd be able to reject some people. Now, Jesus teaches in this parable that the love of God does not allow us to have religious or political or racial limits on who we consider a neighbor, on who we would seek to bless, on who we would seek to love in God's name. We don't get to create limits. God certainly did not. Now, when I took that group from church to Israel, our tour bus took the ancient road from Jerusalem to Jericho. It's quite a famous road. And the road is famous for all of its twists and turns and its many hiding places for bandits. Anyone hearing this story would not have been surprised to hear that there were bandits that caught this guy on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. In just under 17 miles, the road drops dramatically from Mount Zion, which is 2,700 feet above sea level, to Jericho, which is 800 feet below sea level. That's a huge drop, 200 feet per mile. When Jesus began this parable, talking about this road, this famous road from Jerusalem to Jericho, it was kind of like taking his audience to a Star Wars movie, okay? Everyone knew that they were about to be entertained with a story filled with action and adventure and maybe some humor as well. And boy, did they get what they were looking for. This was great entertainment. It also had great meaning and purpose that still sticks with us today. Now, Jesus imagines, remember, it's a parable. He's making up a story. Jesus imagines a man who is beaten and robbed and stripped of his clothes. Now, in the Middle East, there are two ways to figure out who belongs to which tribe when you're walking down the road. The first is to hear them speak. You could tell if they are Jewish or Arabic or perhaps one of the Christian groups that lives in the area by the way that they speak, the accent that they have, the language that they use. The other way is that you could tell a person's tribal identity by the clothes that they wear. It's not so different today than it was back in those days. It was language and it was clothing that differentiated the different tribal groups that lived in the region. Well, in today's story, the victim is unconscious, so he cannot speak. And the victim has been stripped naked. So nobody would be able to tell what tribe he belonged to and who needed to take care of him. I think Jesus does this on purpose to force you and me, as we're reading this story, to identify with this victim. There are no identity markers that show him to be a Jewish person or a Samaritan or a Gentile. And so we are to empathize. We're to put ourselves in the skin of the person, the victim on the side of the road. Now, the first person to find the victim was a priest. The priests were rich. The priests were powerful. The priest was probably riding on a donkey because they were privileged. And it should be no surprise to us that a priest shows up in today's story. It wasn't to the original audience of Jesus, because Jericho was a city that was filled with priests. The priests would have to spend about 2 weeks here and there serving in the Temple of Jerusalem, and a lot of priests lived in Jericho and commuted 17 miles into Jerusalem for a couple weeks a year in order to serve in the Holy Temple. Now, priests had some very strict rules about ritual purity. They were not allowed to touch a corpse. In fact, a priest was not allowed to even be touched by the shadow from a coffin covering a corpse. My goodness. Now, the priest, he's not necessarily a bad guy, but if he gets involved, the priest would be publicly shamed in the temple because he was contaminated. He would be unable to receive his priestly income, so he and his family would be impoverished, and he would have to spend a lot of money in order to purchase and sacrifice a red heifer in order to restore his ritual purity. Now, if his family was listening in on Jesus' story, all of his family, all of his servants, all of his priestly colleagues, all of his neighbors in the community would have celebrated the priest because he loved God more than he loved his neighbor. He made a higher priority of his ritual purity than loving the person injured in front of him. And yet we know that that's morally wrong, don't we? Now, the second person to find the victim was a Levite. And the Levites took a lifelong vow not to cut their hair, not to drink wine, and not to touch dead bodies. The Levite is following the priest from Jerusalem to Jericho, presumably because there's safety in numbers. That's how this story should be read, that one was following the other. Now, the Levite had more flexibility about the vows that he took than the priest. On the other hand, if the Levite stopped to help the victim, it means that he was second-guessing the priest's interpretation of the law and caring for a neighbor. The Levite was not necessarily a bad guy either, but he didn't want to dishonor God by dishonoring the priest. So once again, the community that the Levite belonged to would have celebrated him for loving God more than he loved the stranger. And yet we know there's something morally wrong with that. Now, Jesus' audience, the original audience, they were expecting a Jewish layperson to show up next. That's the normal way of things. But Jesus surprised everything by bringing in a religious and political and racial outsider into the story. The Samaritan is not a pagan. He believes in God, and he follows the Old Testament law, which demands to care for a person in a situation like this. The Samaritan also risked ritual impurity, just like the Levite, just like the priest, and he risked attack from the robbers, and he risked financial loss by caring for a man who might never repay him. Besides, this is a religious, political, racial outsider, and if someone saw him put this naked abused man on his donkey, they would have assumed the worst, especially if he was this man's kinsman. They would have assumed that the Samaritan was bad and had done something bad to that person. The Samaritan risked everything in order to love God by loving his neighbor at the same time. Now, Jesus made a hero out of the Samaritan, a despised Samaritan, in order to shock his original audience. And 2,000 years later, the shock has completely worn off. We think Samaritans are the good guys. If you want to understand this parable correctly, think of someone who worships differently from you. Think of someone who votes differently from you. Think of someone who looks different from you. And they risk everything in order to save your skin. Being a good Samaritan means loving your enemy like a neighbor because you love God. Now, the Christian church has done a poor job of loving one another in this divisive moment in history. We need to repent and believe the gospel. Jesus said, "Everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." Before we could hope to welcome new people into the love of Jesus, we need to figure out how to love our fellow believers who have different opinions from us. Now, I believe that Bethany Covenant Church has a great future of blessing our community with the transforming love of Jesus Christ. But before we could do that very effectively with integrity, we need to learn how to love God by loving even the people that we disagree with in our community as our cherished neighbors. This is our call as Christians, that they will know that we are Christians by our love. Let us start there, and then let us find a way to love people who are very different from us with this perfect love that can only come from God above. God bless you, and God bless God's church here at Bethany.